So hello everyone and welcome to the first session of this year's TOBELTA conference. We're delighted to see all of you here and we hope you have a fantastic time on this Friday and Saturday. We've got 2 days packed full of great sessions for you. Go ahead to take a look at our program and take a look at all the great talks we've got coming up. So to begin, we've got our opening plenary from Luke Meddings. Luke, let me get my notes. Luke is an award-winning author, trainer, and international speaker. In 2000, he co-founded the Dogma ELT movement with Scott Thornbury, and their book Teaching Unplugged won a British Council Elton Award in 2010. Since then, Luke has trained extensively, and in 2011 set up independent e-publishing collective The Round with Lindsay Clanfield. Their own book, 52, A Year of Subversive Activity for the ELT Classroom, was published in 2012. I highly recommend it. It's one of my favourite ELT books ever, and I'm not just saying that because you're here, Luke. Luke was the plenary speaker at our BELTA Day last year, and we're really happy to welcome him back for this TOBELTA conference. Luke is always a fascinating speaker. He's always thought-provoking, and as assessment is a particularly thought-provoking and controversial subject, I'm really looking forward to hearing what Luke has to say about it. Okay, so thank you everyone. Thank you, Luke, and over to you.
Thank you, James. Thanks so much. Thanks for those kind words. Thanks to yourself and Tyson and John for asking me to be part of this. And thanks to all of you for coming by. It's obviously going to be a great conference and a wonderful opportunity to share thoughts on what, as James says, is a very controversial area. And I wouldn't say that I'm not an authority on assessment as such, but I would say that assessment has always been and is an increasingly important part of my life as an educator. James mentioned the book Teaching Unplugged that I wrote with Scott and the Dogma ELT movement. And I remember in the 1990s, really first experimenting with what became Dogma or the kind of teaching that Scott called Dogma in exam classes. I was teaching Cambridge exams, and I remember some of the first classes in which I stepped back from the course book, in which I really started to explore actually the potential of conversation to drive or to express the lexical approach, really was what I thought I was doing at that time. And that was with CAE, Cambridge Advanced English classes, people preparing for first certificate. And so that, that was a very important part of my professional development. And it's important to note, I think, that although I'm going to challenge a lot of the ways in which testing is used in education and society, that I'm familiar with preparing exam classes, that I see a role for exams and testing in education, as I'm sure we all do. What we're trying to do is to define that role. And the most recent kind of phase of my life in ELT has been since the publication of Teaching Unplugged, where I've been fortunate enough to do teacher training. And as James said, I was very happy to be part of the BELTA conference last year. And I recognize some names in the participant list, people that I've trained in Brazil, for example, worked with in Brazil, Priscilla there. So, talking to colleagues around the world has given me a new perspective. And it's really confirmed my suspicion of the testing culture, if you like, the way that testing is now embedded in almost every aspect of our lives in education. So as I say, although I'm not an expert on devising tests, I care very much about testing, and I care very much about the uses to which it's put. And I think it's something that we all need to take very seriously. testing has changed so much. I remember going through the house where I grew up, actually, some years ago, and finding all kinds of things from my mother's career as a teacher. And there were just boxes and boxes full of handwritten tests, which was how teachers tested in the most part on a day-to-day basis, on a week-to-week basis. In the 1980s, for example, when she was teaching at this particular school. And there were just boxes full of these handwritten tests. And of course, now most of our experience of tests is as highly standardized, often online, and increasingly a corporate experience and a field of education in which corporations are showing enormous and growing interest. So I think it's very interesting to reflect on the way that testing is changing over time. So that's part of the background to this talk and part of the background to my interest in assessment. There's also a background to this specific talk, which is that at IATEFL this year in Manchester, I watched a talk by Jeremy Harmer, who's going to be speaking later, which was called Testing an Uncertain and Approximate Business, is a question, an uncertain and approximate business, why teachers should love testing. And Jeremy gave some of the arguments against testing and some arguments in favor of teachers learning more about testing. And at one point he quoted something that I'd said in conversation with my colleague and friend Chuck Sandy. And I was a little surprised to be quoted in what felt to me quoted out of context. And so I spoke to Jeremy afterwards and spoke about the talk, and many people had strong feelings about it, positive and negative, and that's the mark of a worthwhile talk, I think, that it evokes reactions in people. And that was when the first conversation around myself and Jeremy returning to the subject at this online conference took place back in Manchester. So I'm very grateful for the chance to raise some of the concerns I have in a public space in what I hope will be a positive way, and in a way that reflects what I think is, perhaps it's a truism, but it's nevertheless true, that we all want the same things, with very few exceptions. People in education and organizations involved in defining education policy want to raise standards and promote opportunity and help disadvantaged students to do better. And that's what lies behind the Common Core, which is such a controversial part of US education policy. So it isn't so much a question of finding completely different desires for education as understanding why we have different perspectives. And I think understanding the need as educators to take a position on assessment, take a position on the way that assessment is being used in our lives and in our world. So again, I'm grateful to be here and to have the chance to do that. Now, I don't know if any of you will recognize this character. Feel free to. Okay, well, Marine, I'm guessing, could be a French name. Asterix. Number of you typing there. It doesn't matter if you do recognize him or don't. Asterix, not Obelix, David, Asterix, is a French cartoon character from the 1960s, and he was made famous in a series of books that ran through the 1960s and 1970s. And he represents, I don't know, the spirit of independence. He's a Gallic warrior, part of an indigenous tribe in the north of France. And he really represents in these books the little guy who stands up to power, in this case, the Roman Empire. I don't know if he really speaks truth to power, but he does start a lot of fights. Now, the guy who drew the books is still alive, but he's retired. He's called Albert Uderzo. He is called Albert Uderzo. And he actually came out of retirement in January of this year and drew 2 beautiful cartoons in response to the Charlie Hebdo killings in Paris. So he's still with us. And meanwhile, the Asterix franchise, as it's become, continues to flourish in France. In cinemas, there's been a big movie recently. I know there's at least one Asterix theme park. And so the little warrior, who symbolizes the spirit of independence, has perhaps inevitably become big business. But let's think of how he's positioned in the stories, what he represents there, and the kind of opposition that is involved, the oppositional narrative. What we have here is a home page, well, the first page, because it was an actual page made of paper, of all the Asterix books. And now this page was a big part of my childhood because it was the same in every story. It had a lovely reassuring feel when you saw that same page at the start of a book, because you knew that you had a morning of happy reading to look forward to. And I read and reread these books, first in English and then in French. And it's actually one of the things that helped me to learn French, possibly explains why my French is very strange. I'm just going to read it to you, or rather read the text to you, so that you understand the setting for these stories. So the year, this is the text at the bottom of that illustration, the year is 50 BC. Gaul is entirely occupied by the Romans. Well, not entirely. One small village of indomitable Gauls still holds out against the invaders, and life is not easy for the Roman legionaries who garrison the fortified camps of Tatorum, Aquarium, Laudanum, and Compendium. I love the fact that they named one of those camps after an opiate drug, Laudanum. Nice example of children's text working on different levels, just as modern films do. So the idea is that Asterix is the leader of a group of Gauls who occupy this one remaining independent village, and the whole force of the Roman Empire is ranged against them. And I now realize, this is another level, I guess, and this is part of being an adult, that it's a very ironic positioning of French identity, because at this time, France was a powerful nation and a nation with an empire, but it was actually losing its empire over the exact period that the books were written. So in a sense, in real time, France was Rome, and the village could be the colonies who were striving for their independence. So interesting levels of meaning as you look back at these texts. Well, it doesn't matter if you know the stories or the characters, because what matters is that there is a kind of power struggle going on. That's the narrative. And Rome, the Roman Empire, already has control of most of the known world in those days, but it wants all the world, including this little village. And I think it might be helpful to imagine our classrooms as a village, or your classroom as a village. And I want you to at least consider the possibility that the big testing organizations are Rome, and that they want to occupy your village. The Star Wars franchise is being revived, and the second film in the series, or the third, was called The Empire Strikes Back. Well, this next chart might be called The Village Strikes Back. Because by giving the test a rest, I hope as educators we will strike back. And I hope that we can shake Caesar, the character in the right-hand corner. He looks a little like George Bush there. I hope we can shake Caesar, or at least resist him. I think we need to feel that resistance is an option. And there are many ways to express that resistance, some of them perilous and require bravery. Others of which can be very small scale and can be to do with building our own sense of independence as educators. How can we resist the testing empire? We don't have a magic potion. Asterix and his colleagues, including Obelix, relied on a magic potion to win their fights. We do have education, and we need to educate ourselves as well as our students. And I would argue that to navigate the modern testing landscape, we need to understand what lies between us as classroom educators, as educators in schools and universities, and what I'm characterizing here by analogy as Rome, the testing empire, the corporate interests who are increasingly defining the way not just testing, but education and teaching are conducted in schools. We need to navigate this space between us. We can't be entirely independent, but equally we cannot ignore what is happening in education. We need to understand what the testing empire wants and how it operates so that we can work out what to do. We need to understand not just the mechanics of testing and how it is done, but the uses to which it is put. And if we don't do this, if we don't make an effort to understand the space, to reach out to colleagues in other contexts and see how assessment is affecting them, we won't be able to navigate it. And the space, as in any power struggle involving an empire, will be taken away from us. And I said at the beginning that the latest phase of my life in ELT has been as a teacher trainer in different countries. And when I train, I encourage teachers to move away from the course book, to move away from published resources, and to use the learners as a resource, which is one of the basic premises of dogma or teaching unplugged. And this really resonates with the colleagues I work with on training courses. It kind of speaks to our instinctive sense of what we should and can achieve as educators, but very often people cite the test, a sort of abstract entity which has a physical presence, as the reason why they can't do this or can't do it more often. People say, oh, we'd love to teach like this, but there's a new test that's coming out. We used to teach like this, but there's so much testing these days that we simply can't do stuff that comes out of students' interests, stuff that's more exploratory, stuff that's more spontaneous in class. And this is an extremely strong theme in the UK right now, where I live. It's an even stronger theme in the US. But it's, as I've said, it's a theme that I'm observing everywhere. When I train, there's this spirit of independence because we're talking about everything we can achieve with our students. But sort of in our peripheral vision always is the empire or the Caesar of testing. The testing empire has really grown since I started teaching back in 1987. And I thought I'd do a tally of well-known ELT exams, and this was pretty much back of the envelope stuff, if you like. But my estimate of a dozen or so well-known ELT exams, of the kind that many of us will be preparing our students for, is that the number has pretty much doubled in a quarter of a century since I started teaching. Just out of interest, which do you think was the first Cambridge exam, and therefore the first sort of modern ELT exam? Which one do you think it was, and when do you think it was first administered? Do you want to type an answer or a guess? CE asks Natalia. Oxford exams 1970s, says Yuris, suggests Yuris. TOEFL 1965, Anka suggests. Julie is typing. And so is Claudie. Well, I'll just wait for one more answer. Civil service stuff. Okay, well, that's back to the first standardized exams in the civil service in the 19th century. But yeah, actually, Julie gets it. It was the proficiency, the Cambridge proficiency exam, and it, I'm sure, was very difficult. It's still pretty difficult. And I'll just type the date here. Maybe a surprise to some of you. It was a surprise to me. It first came out in 1913. So I did a tally of well-known exams that were already in use when I started teaching. So there was the proficiency, which was launched in 1913. The first certificate was developed in the 1930s, presumably to produce a slightly more practical and less fearsome test of English. TOEFL came out in 1964, apparently, Branko. You said 65. I'd say that is the right answer. TOEIC, earlier than I thought, TOEIC came out in 1979. And the PET exam, one of Cambridge's raft of exams, came out in 1980. So when I started teaching, the kind of key exams in terms of what we offered our students at schools in London were the Cambridge Proficiency, Cambridge First Certificate, TOEFL and TOEIC, both administered by ETS in the States, and the PET exam. Pretty soon after I started teaching, IELTS was launched by the British Council in 1989. I think it had been in development previously, but it was sort of relaunched as a British Council product in 1989. Then Cambridge brought out the advanced exam in 1991, and the entry-level CET exam in 1994. Cambridge also introduced some young learners exams in 1997, starters, movers and flyers. And the British Council's latest exam is APTIS, which is an assessment product which was launched in 2012. So that's 5 new exams on top of the 5 that I was familiar with as a young teacher, doubling their number in around 25 years. Pearson also administer young learner tests under the names First Words, Springboard, Quick March, and Breakthrough. And it's definitely worth noting this growth in the young learner market and the young learner testing market. So you have young learner tests administered by Pearson. You have the entry-level CET exam, and you have Cambridge's own young learners exams. So twice as many exams, roughly, in 25 years. So it's a growth market. That's nothing to what's happening in education as a whole, if we go beyond language teaching and beyond ELT, and especially in the United States. Bear in mind that still what starts in the United States often follows elsewhere. And this is a quote, which in my haste I haven't attributed, I can find it later, is an estimate in an article on US education. The business of assessing students through high school, has grown 57% in the past 3 years to $2.5 billion. So again, that's doubling the kind of market value of the testing sector. This is not irrelevant to us because we're English language teachers. but we're also educators. And it's doubly relevant to us because two of the biggest players in the US high school testing market, Pearson and ETS, are among the biggest players in ELT. No, it's not just ELT and the testing, the range of testing products on offer that's changed in the last 25 years. The world has changed and the market for English has changed alongside it, in some ways influencing that growth. And people around the world are now moving with the market. So the testing empire hasn't grown by mistake. The testing empire has grown because it reflects this new market, which is characterized by globalization and migration. And here I think we're really talking about sort of positive migration in search of employment rather than sort of negative migration away from war and famine and so on. So the testing economy reflects the global economy, but it also helps to shape that market because English is such an important factor within globalization. And testing helps to shape the market at school level by defining expectations, by expressing those expectations in business vocabulary, and increasingly by defining the purposes and practices of education in terms of client-customer relationships. So when I talk about a raft of products for example, Cambridge's language exams, I'm myself using business vocabulary to talk about what were perhaps 25, 30 years ago thought of not so much as products, but as educational services or simply as exams. So the context in which we consider testing, the context in which we administer testing, i.e. the global market, has changed and the testing market has changed in response to it. But it also helps to shape expectations. It's not a sort of passive player in this. Well, interesting comment by Mark in Japan. First you get the standardized test, then you get the anxiety, then you get the money. I think it's very important to bear in mind anxiety, because that's actually what's driving my interest in assessment. It's what drives the various movements against high-stakes standardized testing. It's anxiety about what's happening in the classroom and what's happening to our children, and the sheer level of testing that they're undergoing in schools, and the level of testing that they're undergoing in order to acquire English. The growth in young learners exams is a good example of that. And of course, you know, money is absolutely central to all of this. And Pearson, like all successful corporations, follow the money. Did a little bit of research on Pearson after reading some articles. And I was interested to find that Pearson started as a construction company in 1844, so it's nearly 200 years ago. They moved into banking and newspapers after the First World War, so around 100 years ago. And they only really got a foothold in education in 1968 when they bought Longman. So Pearson's heritage in education is actually quite recent, but it's very aggressive. Since 2000, it has steadily acquired testing, assessment, and qualifications businesses. We cannot talk seriously about assessment without taking this empire building into account. This isn't an emotional response, it's a considered response to the evidence. In the old days, they said when coins like this were currency, that all roads lead to Rome. And when you start to look at assessment seriously, it seems like all roads lead to Pearson. But they're not alone in terms of corporate business interests moving in on education. I'm going to introduce you later to a book called More Than a Score, which was edited by an educator called Jesse Hagopian, who was one of the teachers behind the test boycott at Garfield High School in Seattle in the States. And the book quotes Bill Gates, who's a big supporter of the Common Core State Standards Initiative in the United States. It quotes Bill Gates in a speech from 2009. And Bill Gates says, or said, and I think this is an absolutely crucial quote because it shows us that a non-educator is instrumental in shaping education policy, and it shows us how a highly integrated education system or policy which combines testing and curriculum and assessment mechanisms is affecting our day-to-day lives. So Bill Gates said, when the tests are aligned to the common standards, the curriculum will line up as well. And that will unleash powerful market forces in the service of better teaching. Well, there are many people who might agree with Bill Gates that powerful market forces can lead to better teaching, but I'm not one of them. And I would guess that many teachers will be very skeptical at this point. And we need to be skeptical. It's part of our responsibility as educators to be skeptical. So when we hear, for example, President Obama in a State of the Nation address to the states talking about teaching to the test and saying that we need to stop teaching to the test, he's talking about an educational environment where it's almost impossible to stop teaching to the test because it's this highly integrated system backed by powerful market forces. So I don't think I'm stretching a point when I talk about an empire. And Jeremy rightly stressed in his talk that I've mentioned at IATEFL earlier this year that teachers need to understand how testing works and to learn more about the mechanisms of testing. And I'd argue that to understand what's going on, we need to look at the broader picture, not just in terms of education as a whole, beyond ELT, but in terms of social and economic trends in the wider culture. This is a lovely advertisement, a kind of retro advertisement. And again, it's rather like that quote by Bill Gates. It kind of embodies a lot of what's happening in our world today. It's an advertisement for IBM products directed at the Indian market in 1970. And it uses a very local image and a local message around the idea of grains of rice to express a kind of globalization policy. And I'm just going to read to you what it says in the small print here, because it isn't legible, I know that. And I want you to imagine that this advertising copy from around 45 years ago is talking not about business, but about education today. Because I think it could easily be talking about education today. So the headline is, "We sift facts. The ever-changing pattern of today's business generates a multitude of facts. Facts that have to be correlated and analyzed to provide meaningful and timely reports for decision making. Sifting your facts is our business." It talks about IBM centers in New Delhi, Bombay, Calcutta, and Madras offer computer expertise. I'm sorry, it's so small even on my own computer here. Offer computer expertise to process data relating to any facet of your business. You feed your source data to any of our data centers. We process it, and you get back printed reports to your specifications to help you plan growth, set goals, and take the guesswork out of running your business. Well, I think it's very easy to imagine it's possible to hear that kind of discourse in the context of education these days. The power of data and the power specifically of granular data, of tiny bits of data rather than broader picture. So data that can only be understood quantitatively and not qualitatively. Our world is increasingly a quantitative world where data dominates perception of services and even of whole societies. Our world is increasingly granular and numerical. these are the times we live in. So when Pearson launched a new framework to accompany or challenge the Common European Framework, which they did in October last year, it makes perfect sense in this context of a broader culture which relies more on quantitative data than on qualitative assessment of needs. At its launch, Pearson said that the G-set delivers scores based on the global scale of English, a standardized granular scale that measures English language proficiency in a way that is consistent and actionable for learners, teachers, and employers. Unlike other frameworks which describe attainment in broad bands, the global scale of English identifies what a learner can do at each point on the scale across speaking, listening, reading, and writing skills. For instance, a person who has a speaking ability of 29 can identify and order very common food and drink for a menu, or someone who scores a 53 can write a letter of complaint. So I take it from that people should go to restaurants in pairs and split their skills. But on the face of it, being more accurate is a wonderful gift. In terms of how it is actioned, to use that language, in schools and in classrooms, I'm not convinced. I think there's a lot to be said for broad bands that allow us as teachers the space to intervene meaningfully in the learning process. So the idea of granular information is absolutely central to the times that we live in. There's a lovely quote from a book called The Revolution of Everyday Life by a Belgian called Raoul Weinigem. He was writing in 1967. And he wrote that economic imperatives seek to impose on the whole of human activity the standardized measuring system of the market. Every aspect of public and private life, he wrote, is dominated by the quantitative. And you could map that almost exactly onto what we see happening in education now. I mentioned that as part of Jeremy's talk at ITEFL and as part of the balance he was giving critiques of testing and more positive views of testing, he quoted myself and my colleague and friend Chuck Sandy. And it was the fact that it was a brief quote which surprised both of us, and I Googled to find where that quote had come from. And it came from one of my own blog posts on Chuck's own ITDI website. And I thought I'd revisit some of the things that I said in that blog post just to give a sense of where a phrase like more than a score, which has been taken up, as we can see, by educators in the States, probably independently of any conversation we have, and the context for an idea like giving the test a rest. It's not a snap judgment or a snappy thought. It's a way of trying to express a form of resistance to something that is impacting on our daily lives. In this blog, and I must give you the link. I'm going to quote it now, but I'm going to put the link in the text box there. I talked about five areas or five lenses that would help us to think about testing and assessment in our own academic context. First of all, ideology. This is, I understand, is a slightly heavy-looking slide. Let me talk through what I wrote in that blog, and you're welcome to look back at it later on. The idea of ideology. This is an ideological issue. It relates to power structures, and it relates to the portrayal of standardized testing as value neutral. The idea that standardized testing is good because it is neutral and that it is fair. And we can see this in the literature of testing And in this literature of alignment, as in a quote from Bill Gates, where new tests, increasingly online tests, are always portrayed as being in line with best practice. And this is evidenced by their alignment with frameworks like the CEF and the GSET. But we have to understand that standardized testing isn't value neutral. Even as a product, as a commercial product, it isn't value neutral. So we need to consider the ideology at work here, the power structures at work. I think psychology is an interesting area as well. This relates to our sense of empowerment as educators, to how we feel about testing, to how we feel about our ability to critique this empire of testing. And there's something about the dynamic of the oppressor and the oppressed here, and there's reference made to this in the work of Paulo Freire, there's reference made to it in the work before him of Frantz Fanon, or Frantz Fanon. And the idea is that if oppression is sufficiently advanced, then it becomes hard to believe that this oppression is being carried out against one's best interests. On some level, if it's part of our daily lives, we have to buy into it, and it becomes very difficult to counter it. Our skepticism is weakened by the power structure. And we can even start to empathize somehow with the people who are oppressing us, and we can start to think, well, it must be awfully hard to make these standardized tests. And it starts to weaken our own perspective on this. I think our psychology as teachers is an interesting area. It's an extremely difficult job to do, just to be in a classroom with other people, and then the kind of scrutiny that we're under day to day, and the scrutiny that is reinforced by testing makes it harder and harder to question what's going on. It might be harder in a generation than it is for us now. If teachers are coming into a system which has always been characterized by heavy testing, how much harder to see this as an ideology, and how much harder to get a sense of one's own position in relation to it. I've already touched on the economic issue, and that relates to the opportunities seen by corporations for profit, and the sort of mechanism by which in the public school system a failing school is seen as an opportunity for improvement, and improvement that uses the kind of data that IBM was selling to their Indian market in 1970. We need to be sensitive to this, and we need to be prepared to criticize organizations within our own field if we feel that they are selling testing too much, and to be wary of offering too much testing to our own students. And this is a very complex world. If we work in private schools, we work in the market also. If we work in government schools, then we're subject to the constraints and the directives of policy. So these are not easy things. But the argument I'm making is that we have to get a point of view on this. We have to get a perspective. Pedagogy. What can we do on a day-to-day level? Yes, it's difficult to create systemic change, certainly as individual educators. But we can do things differently in the classroom. We can research formative assessment, and we can use formative approaches as a route to dialogue with students and parents. We can keep progressive, regular assessment of coursework as a part of our own classes as far as possible. We can make our own tests. We can engage our students in the creation of tests. And as far as possible, even if it's for just parts of our lesson, we can stop teaching to the test. It's difficult, but if we don't find the space to move away from that curriculum and from that imperative, then the space will disappear. There's an interesting organization in the UK called the Villiers Park Education Trust, and it reaches out to pupils living in disadvantaged areas by helping them to develop a passion for their subject. And they have a chief executive called Richard Gould, and he says that the way to reach out to these disadvantaged pupils is by not getting them to do anything that's in their exam specification. The way to reach out is by not getting them to do anything that's in their exam specification. But guess what? They end up with better grades. So there is a balance to be struck here, and we can, in a sense, serve the system. We can do the jobs that we're contracted to do. We can move towards our students. We can reach out to their needs and interests and revive our own interest in our own subjects. And that, if we wanted to, will still serve the system. So, these things can be done in tandem. There is a balance to be struck here in education, which is increasingly becoming unbalanced. And finally, there's a political issue. And by political, I mean an issue with which we need to engage as citizens. And this is all about countering this testing empire by making space in our classrooms, by reaching out to colleagues, and by taking into account that this can only work if we collaborate across school systems and across countries. It needs to be an international project of resistance. For that to take root or to take shape, we need to make an argument. We need to talk to students, parents, colleagues, education managers, education departments, and education ministers. If you want to read back my ideas on those 5 areas, then as I say, I've given you the link in the chat box there. And as with any of these ideas, if you want to engage with me personally and continue the conversation, you're very welcome to. Okay, now some of the arguments that I've come up against are arguments that you may come up against and may have come up against if you start conversations with colleagues about assessment and express your concerns about standardized testing. And I've started to call these arguments not analogies, but banalities, because they're becoming over familiar. 2 examples. One is the idea that if you criticize standardized testing, you're rejecting the whole idea of assessment, and you're saying that exams don't have a role to play in the classroom in terms of motivation, in terms of measurement, and so on. But it's not the same thing. And the author of the book, More Than a Score, Jesse Hagopian, says in a very nice interview, which I found only today, and which I'll again copy into the chat box for you. Teachers, this is his words, teachers invented testing, so I'm not against testing, I'm not against assessment. What I am against is the inundation of our classrooms with standardized testing. We shouldn't have to say as educators that we think that testing has a role in our classrooms. As Jesse says, teachers invented testing, how can we be against it? It's about how it's used. Just linking to that for you if you're interested. The other argument that I've come across and which troubles me, see why I'm failing with that link, just bear with me once more. It's not happening. That's the name anyway. I'll give you his quote in text form. You can Google it. I must be just using the wrong keys. Not working. Not to worry. Google Jesse Hagopian. The other argument that troubles me is a kind of shock tactic, which suggests that if we weren't to test the English of airline pilots, for example, using very stringent assessment methods, then what would happen? Well, planes would crash. And planes have crashed, and planes have crashed on the runways because of poor English. And that's why English for aviation gained currency in the 1970s following a particularly awful runway crash in Tenerife in Spain. To say that you wouldn't want to undergo open heart surgery if the surgeon hadn't been tested is to take the idea of testing into a realm where it's bound to feel shocking, and it's to take it out of the context of education. So I think we should be wary of analogies of that sort. And I think also we should be wary of developing a kind of, I don't know, assessment, an admiration for assessment just in terms of the mechanics of it. One of the arguments that Jeremy made in his talk was that teachers should learn about testing, and yes, we should. But I think also it's worth bearing in mind that testing is a specialized area. We could also, and equally, encourage all teachers to become experts at whole child education or critical pedagogy. It is one aspect of our work. I'm not convinced that we all need to be experts, kind of qualified testing experts, if you like. But certainly we need to understand how tests are put together. We need to be familiar with the language of assessment. And there's a very good summary of this on Cambridge English's own website. Again, I'll look for the link for you. I mean, the basic principles of testing include validity, reliability, impact, practicality. And yes, it's important to know how tests are put together, but what we're arguing about here, what we're talking about, isn't just about how testing is done. We're looking at the impact of testing. And focusing on the internal mechanics of testing at this point in time is like looking at the problem of too many cars on the road and saying, yes, but the cars are so well engineered. Of course, we can admire the engineering, but it's the impact on the environment that we need to focus on. I think Branca's, I'm not using this chat box often enough here. Branca, external testing is what bothers me. Teachers should be trusted. Mark says, I agree, Branca. I think this is where this move away from a broadband assessment criteria or assessment framework to a highly granular numerical one is just not a good thing, and we need to be extremely skeptical of it. Because all of this relates to, as Branca says, the trust issue. Is there any trust for teachers on the ground in classrooms at the moment? Increasingly there isn't, and testing is being used as a kind of rod to assess not just students but also teachers. Okay, I've given a talk previously called Give the Test a Rest. And I wanted to call this talk Giving the Test a Rest because it's what some extremely courageous educators are starting to do. The book I mentioned to you earlier is called More Than a Score. It's very interesting because it details the process of resistance within a real school environment. And there are many articles, even poems. It's a very interesting series of kind of eyewitness accounts to resistance and to the process of taking on an extremely risky responsibility to say to either the head of one's school or the head of one's school department or the head of the city education department that the level of testing in schools is damaging students and that as teachers we're not prepared to stand by as this happens. So there are three examples of people giving the test a rest, and that's not dismissing testing from an emotional standpoint. It's not just being snappy with slogans. More Than a Score, the new uprising against high stakes testing, available in paperback and as a Kindle book as well. Next to it is an article from The Guardian in the UK, which is called Head Teachers Vote to Boycott SATs Tests. And then next to it also an article, a very recent one, from The Atlantic Monthly, an online magazine, which says in its headline that the movement to opt out of nationwide exams in the States again is gaining traction and forcing policymakers to rethink the role of such assessments in public education. In other words, the idea of giving the test a rest is becoming a reality. And the ways in which we do this are going to vary on context. They're going to vary on our position, not just in schools, but in life. Again, there's a lot of fascinating detail about the discussions in staff rooms about who was going to refuse to give a state test. Would it be younger people, perhaps without families, or would it be older people who have responsibilities to kids and dependents? There are elements to bear in mind in all of this. But this is a considered movement against testing. What can we do as English language teachers? One idea that I've come up with and mentioned before is the idea of an equation for education, which I call 50-free. And the simple equation is that we should be free of the curriculum, free of the syllabus, free of assessment for half of every lesson. I think that what we do in that half of the lesson will feed back into all of that anyway. Now, some people might say I do that anyway. Some people might say that they're free all the time to do what they want. But in many teaching contexts, there is almost no freedom to move away from pre-prepared lesson plans, from the curriculum, and from the whole feeding machine into the standardized test. So my idea here is not to reject testing, but to express the idea of a balancing education. I'm working on a book at the moment, and the subtitle is an equation for education, and the idea of it is to do something to balance this relentless focus on increased testing, increasingly standardized testing, and increased testing for very young learners. How can we do that as language teachers? We can use the resources we have available to us. We can think about formative instead of summative assessment. The image of the potter's wheel, I think, is a nice one, because although it's very hands-on, it's an extremely skilled thing to do, and to form the shape of something can easily go wrong and slip out of someone's hands and there's clay on the ceiling. So, moving away from standardized testing is not an easy option. Formative assessment is not an easy option. It's one we need to be hands-on with. We need to work with our students. There's an example of an e-portfolio. There are many such things online. Many of you will have done things like that with your students. We can use programs like Evernote, platforms like Evernote, to allow our students to continue building coursework and to assess it as educators, even if the standardized testing increasingly doesn't want to look at it. OneNote is good too, John says. So I'd like to encourage you in summary to think of ways that you can influence this great debate. Everyone agrees that education needs to be fair. Everyone agrees that education needs to help disadvantaged people also. That's part of the discourse of the Common Core. It's part of the discourse of Ofsted, if you look carefully enough, in the UK. But what's the real impact of taking away trust from teachers, and that phrase that Branke used, and in fact, placing all our trust in measurement systems? What's the real impact on that? I'd urge you to have a look at the book, More Than a Score, and I'd urge you to think about ways that you can fight back, whether it's simply by moving away from the syllabus part of the time, unplugging, we call it in ELT, but really it's just an expression of progressive education. How can we keep space for our students, for their needs, and for ourselves as teachers, and for the community within schools to explore and enjoy subjects and not make them a locus, a place of anxiety, which was a word that we saw used earlier. So with that, and with the time at 1/2 past something, depending on where we are in the world, I'd like to thank you for your attendance. I'd like to wish you all a great conference. I'm going to see as much as I can. I'm looking forward to it. And I just would stress that this talk has been given in a spirit of engagement and collegiality and continuing this conversation about this very important subject. So thanks, everyone.
So thank you, Luke. As I suspected, that was a very thought-provoking and fascinating way to kick off our conference. So thank you very much. It's a great way to begin.
Thank you, James.
And remember, everyone, that Luke mentioned Jeremy Harmon's talk there quite a lot, and we've got Jeremy coming up at the end of this day, so it'll be interesting. I know Jeremy's here in the room, so if you want to know Jeremy's response, then stick around. Later in the day, you'll be able to find out. I can't wait. Okay, so thank you, Luke. Thanks, everyone. We've got more sessions coming up immediately. There we go. There's the schedule. So you'll see that in this room next, we've got Divya Madhavan, and in the Tesla Toronto room, we've got Kate Finnegan. So you can decide now whether you want to stay here or whether you want to go over to the other room. The link is in the chat box over on the right. Okay, so have a great day, everyone, and I'll see you later.
Thanks, James.
Okay, you want to say something?
Thanks so much.
Tyson?
Yeah, I just wanted to say thanks so much, Luke. It's been a total pleasure having you here again. And yeah, if you have any questions for Luke, we'll try to keep a tab on them a little bit.
That would be great.
And maybe you can answer them another time or a little bit later. Okay.
Thanks for the comments in the chat as well. There's some really interesting stuff. So we'll make sure, Luke, you get a chance to go back and have a look at that, because it's very interesting.
That would be terrific. I'd love to get that. Okay.
We'll give you about 5 minutes to decide which session you want to go to, if you're going to stay here with Divya or come over to the Tesla Toronto room for Kate Finnegan. We'll start a little bit late. So